Earlier this year, I tested out Multicolor FDM Printing for Tabletop Terrain, and I came away from that video seriously impressed with the Snapamaker U1. And since then, I've been obsessed, printing Multicolor FDM Terrain almost non-stop. And today, I finally get to start showcasing these terrain projects here on the channel, because the very first episode of my group's brand new D&D campaign, The Ruins of Roltaria, just went live over on Roll for Adventure, featuring the terrain we'll be making today. This new campaign is the start of an epic journey, and it's what a lot of my projects here on the channel have been building towards. From the RGB lanterns lighting the room, to the DM screen on our brand new table, and a ton of the minis and terrain you've seen me make here on the channel. So, whether you're into actual plays, love D&D, or just want to see how some of the projects I've done here on the channel all come together, go and check out that episode first. I'll leave some links up top and down below. Then, once you've finished that, come back here, see how I put together the awesome multicolor battle map that you will have seen us use in that very first session. Alright, consider yourself warned, from here on out, we're in spoiler territory. Let's dive in. For those who watched my first multicolor terrain video, you'll know that my terrain of choice is dungeon blocks, an awesome grid-based system that does away with the need for magnets or clips and prints up super cleanly on the U1. Today I'm printing off a collection of blocks from their medieval towns collections, along with some larger terrain pieces from another creator to help flesh out our map a little quicker. Of course, this printing project started with the rather tedious process of assigning colours to our blocks digitally. This can take anywhere from a minute or two for simple blocks to 10 or even 20 minutes for larger, more complex models. But even having to spend that long assigning colours, to then be able to print as many copies as I would like, that's far more my speed than having to prime and paint every piece of terrain I print. And I do actually want to quickly touch on this, because there were a number of people who left comments on that first video mentioning how much better hand-painted terrain can look. And you're absolutely right, it can, and it does. That's just not quite what I'm after. My personal hobby is 3D printing and painting miniatures. I just don't really enjoy spending a lot of time on painting terrain. So for me, this approach is really about getting something onto the table that looks good, that supports the miniatures I enjoy painting, and lets me spend my hobby time where I get the most value out of it. And for my games, this new terrain works way better than a flat 2D map or gridded paper ever did. So with that in mind, why don't we take a look at the foundation for the map we'll be printing today, in the heart of a small town known as Lionsmane. For some of you, a journey here has been long and arduous, wandering across dry, cracked earth and arid clay. But now, for the first time in days, the ground beneath your feet begins to resemble something closer to a road. And ahead, signs of life begin to take shape on the horizon. Sturdy structures and movement between them, the vague outline of people going about their days. The outskirts of a town known as Lionsmane. The Badlands, as they are so called, remain one of the few places in Roltaria, central though they may be, largely untouched by the War of Embers. This is not a land ruled by factions. And as two of you draw closer to this town, those distant shapes begin to sharpen. Two traders shouting over coin, a child slipping through a crowd disappearing with something that likely wasn't theirs, a group of armed figures standing in the shade watching and waiting. Weapons are carried openly here. There is no attempt to hide them. This is life in the Badlands. In regards to actually printing this terrain, I know that I've had a ton of questions about printer settings and filament choices, and I just want to let everyone know that my next terrain video will be a more in-depth guide covering all of those details. But I'm not going to leave you hanging, so let's at least cover the basics of how the terrain you're seeing today has been printed. I'm very much still dialing these settings in, but for the most part, I'm printing at 0.16 layer heights, which I find captures enough detail without going overboard on print times. I've found that 2 walls with minimal infill is fine for most pieces, but sometimes I bump this up a little for more delicate parts, such as trees or lampposts. And for my print speeds, I think I have these pretty well dialed in for a decent balance between speed and quality. Of course, I'm still very much refining both my settings and my processes, but once I get these more dialed in, I'll be sharing those details in a future video, and of course we'll be making the profiles available on Patreon. But by far the biggest improvement to my settings between these two terrain videos has actually come from your suggestions, to use brims when printing my dungeon blocks. This is because some of my first project's prints suffered from some rather major warping when I hadn't cleaned the plate for a while. But now that I've started printing my dungeon blocks using brims, this issue has all but disappeared, even if I haven't cleaned the plate as often as I maybe should. As for my filament choices, this is a rather long and growing list, so I'll just leave some links to a Google Sheet down below that details all of the various colors I use and what I use them for. Really, this is just a collection of bamboo basic and matte PLAs, along with a couple of eSun and Elegoo filaments as well. Really, it's just been a matter of a ton of research trying to find colors I like that don't feel too garish for terrain. Originally, I wanted to only use matte PLAs, but quickly had to abandon that in favor of good color selections, which does unfortunately mean that some pieces will need a coat of matte varnish after printing. Parts like these walls that I decided looked best in Elegoo PLA brown, or parts like this bed which was printed in eSun Fire Engine red, both of which print a little glossy. And before we continue our printing, I do want to add a little bit of extra functionality to some of these new blocks, using some methods outlined in a previous video to chop and change a few of these designs. Specifically, I don't want to have to print two sets of blocks for lit and unlit street side torches, so instead I brought this design into Blender and used those methods to remove the flame from the rest of the model, and then cut out a 5x2mm socket into both the flame and the lantern pole, which will allow me to drop in some magnets after printing, giving me some far more versatile blocks. But the customization doesn't stop there. I recently picked up a collection of these small battery-powered dollhouse LEDs in both warm and cool whites, and while they're not quite small enough to include in lanterns or candles, they may just work for campfires, braziers, or perhaps fireplaces, allowing me to add some awesome lighting to my dungeon block's terrain. But I need to be pretty precise here, cutting a socket into this terrain that gets the LED close enough to the sculpted fire without creating holes in the mesh, and making sure not to cover the light so much that it can't shine through. So I cut this hole as close to the surface as I could, trying to be as precise as I could be so that the slicer doesn't get confused and try and print a more opaque brown or grey over top of the light. Then, to make sure I could actually add and remove my lights, I created a threaded cover in the base of the block, allowing for much easier access. Moving these over to the slicer, I painted in the orange details of the flame and kept slicing to check that it was only the orange above my LED. And with the slicing as intended, given the semi-translucent finish of this Flashforge orange PLA, we should get an awesome firelight shining through. So now, before I go ahead and talk about my continued experiences with the U1 after some more extended use, why don't we go ahead and print up the next part of our map. Continuing towards Lionsmane, past the scattered buildings that mark its outskirts, even with the occasional lingering stare. Compared to the open road, this is starting to begin feeling something close to safe. That is, of course, until you drift a little closer to town and your eyes drift upwards. Because hanging over the entry arches where there should be nothing at all is a banner. Vibrant yellow, marked with a shield and a forge hammer. Unmistakably the crest of the Watch. For the rest of this build, rather than printing up each and every house using dungeon blocks, I think I want to print a couple of all-in-one pieces to help quickly flesh out town maps like this one. I found these awesome designs by Tired World Studio, their Hexengarde Narrows, which are a collection of buildings and ruins that do look great on their own, but can be easily placed side by side to create cramped towns or cities, which, when scaled correctly, should work great alongside my dungeon blocks collection. But these models are far more complex, and frankly, about halfway through color painting each of these pieces, Snapamaker Orca started to become incredibly laggy. So I whipped up a quick blender tool to help me create some color selections, but even this was not a very robust process. So yes, this is definitely a part of the process that I'll need to continue exploring solutions for in the future, and if I do happen to find a better way to color paint 3D prints, I will be sure to let you know. So, now that I've spent significantly more time with this printer, over 1,000 print hours at this stage to be precise, how have I found it? In my initial video, I mentioned running into some hiccups and errors on the U1, and as people pointed out, I was seeing some sort of issue on nearly 10% of my prints. Well, I'm very happy to report that after updating the firmware on the printer and the slicer to the public release versions, and keeping them updated since, as well as not pausing my prints unnecessarily often, that error rate has gone way down. Of the 750 print hours since that video, I have had maybe 3 prints that have thrown up errors, which is most commonly the toolheads not seating properly once in a blue moon, causing the printer to pause and throw up this error, and when resumed after a few hours on standby, sometimes creates a slight offset on the next layer. And many of the other errors I was running into frequently in the past have disappeared with these new updates. So I'm far more confident in sending prints over to the printer now and expecting them to finish successfully, without needing to worry that 1 in every 5 or 6 prints was going to throw up some sort of error or otherwise fail. For this project alone, I ran several 24 to 48 hour prints that all finished successfully, with no errors whatsoever. So I have to say the Snapamaker team have made huge improvements there compared to my first experience with this machine. Now, before we go ahead and touch on the last thing I want to talk about today, which is time and waste comparisons, why don't we go ahead and get these other buildings printed up and on the board. You do see, as you're about half a block into town, a tavern kind of sitting on a street corner. You can see a few locals and what looks like a few travelers coming and going. Probably a decent place to find information if that's what you're after.
I have a feeling that we could help each other further, and the tavern seems like a good place to figure that out.
By all means.
I'll lead the way.
In terms of waste on the U1, compared to, for example, my previous experience with the A1's AMS, it's night and day. In the last 750 print hours, swapping at least 1 or 2 colors pretty much every print, this is all the purge waste the U1 has produced over those months. A tiny noodle for each color at the start of every print, and the only other waste is the tower itself, which, as long as you dial your settings in and are printing large pieces or multiple objects per plate, is a fraction of the total weight of your print. Let's compare this by slicing the same model on 2 machines. Starting with the A1, which not only takes 43 hours compared to 14 on the U1, but the AMS style printer uses more filament on purges alone than on the actual model, and then it still has to print that tower's worth of material as well. So the U1 is not only saving us nearly 30 hours, but also 350 grams of wasted material. But with all that said, for me, these printers sit in 2 very different categories. In my eyes, the A1 and other AMS style printers are primarily for clean single material printing that happen to have multi-material capabilities for the occasional project. Whereas tool changes, like the U1, are aimed at people who utilize multi-material frequently enough to warrant a machine more dedicated to this style of printing. Overall, I've had an absolute blast continuing to use multicolor printing on a tool changer. It's meant that multicolor printing is no longer just a gimmick that I'm trying to find uses for, and instead has very much become a part of my hobby. It's let me level up my games in a really practical way. Terrain, props, mugs, and random accessories, all printed up in full color and ready to drop straight on the table. And honestly, it's just fun to print with this machine, and I think that that's the most important part. But the real point of this video isn't the printing. It's what it lets me put on the table for my players. So why don't we go ahead and take one last look at Lionsmane. And of course, if you want to understand why this quiet little town is about to turn to absolute chaos, you'll just have to go and check out the first episode of Ruins of Roltaria for yourself. Chaos erupting throughout the town around you.
Bad really fast.
You hear crossbow bolts flying across town. Other individuals that are good with a blade or a bow are helping in the scuffles. But from somewhere closer to the front gates, you hear screaming intensify, begin to see fire dancing in the horizon, and begin to smell smoke. As you hear a member of the watch scream out so that the entire town can hear it, "Stitcher!" As all of you through the smoke that is drifting through the light that is beginning to erupt at the front of town, see a massive shape of some beast, leathery wings silhouetted in smoke. Be sure to head on over to Roll for Adventure and check out the ruins of Roltaria with the links below. We've put a ton of effort into making this the very best it can be from the start, and we're super proud of how it's come out. As always, I'll leave my affiliate links for the U1 down below if you want to take a look. That'll just let Snapamaker know who sent you and help support the channel if you do choose to pick anything up. And if you have enjoyed this video, there's plenty more coming now that Roll for Adventure is up and running, including, of course, that full Multicolor Terrain guide, as well as perhaps revisiting some multicolor miniatures if I can get my hands on the 0.2mm nozzles for the U1. So whether you're interested in either of those projects, or just want to stick around to see what other FDM printing and tabletop projects I get up to, do be sure to subscribe down below. But most importantly, thank you so much for watching, and as always, have a good one. Bum, 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 the first bit of terrain.
Oh shit! Oh fuck, it's so big.
Oh Jesus!
like-
Way
What
bigger
she
than I
said.
thought it was gonna be.
Nice tray.
This is insane, by the way.
Yeah, this took a while.
This is insane.
Yeah, and upstairs, followed by an interior.
Yeah.
Subscribe.
It's so